I'm going to talk a little bit about Al-Qaeda, where it came from, where it is today, and where it hopes to go in the future. Stefan mentioned that I studied and taught at the American University in Cairo from 1969 to 71. A very distinguished sociologist at that school, Saad ad-Din Ibrahim, decided to do a study of the young men that were filling up the prisons in Egypt in the early 70s, radical young Islamists. He wanted to know, who are these people? Where do they come from? To his surprise, he discovered that they were mostly ambitious and well-educated young men. They were drawn to the fields of science and engineering. He called them model young Egyptians. Then decades later, Mark Sageman, who was a CIA case officer during the jihad against the Soviets in Afghanistan and also is a psychiatrist, there's a combination you don't run into every day, he decided to do a study about the young men that were going into the Qaeda camps in the 1990s. And his findings largely mirror those of Saad ad-Din. These were not impoverished social failures. They were, many of them, from middle and upper class families. They were from intact families. They were college educated. They were not the products of the religious schools. Many of them actually were educated in Europe or America. Some of them spoke as many as 5 or 6 languages. They had no obvious mental disorders. And interestingly enough, many of them weren't even very religious when they went into the Al-Qaeda camps. In other words, they were a lot like us. So what is it that draws these young men to radical Islam and especially into Al-Qaeda? If you go back to that Saad ad-Din study in the 70s, one of the things he discovered is that most of these young recruits had come from the rural areas and the villages of Egypt, and they were streaming into Cairo, Alexandria, Mansoura, the big university towns. They were away from their families, perhaps for the first time in their lives, away from their roots. Mark Sageman found the same thing. He labeled this phenomenon displacement. The most common element of all the elements among the young men that he studied was that they had joined jihad in a country other than the one in which they were reared. In other words, they were away from home. They were away from their roots. They were more susceptible to radicalization. Now, this is just as true for Yemenis in Saudi Arabia as it is for Moroccans in France or Pakistanis in England. The element that was in common is that they're away from their home. Now, something similar, different but very similar, I think, is going on in this sense of displacement might be understood better as not just being away from your roots, but feeling marginal in the culture that you're a part of. I think that maybe that was what was at the bottom of what they were studying. Because if you look at the recent plots that have been taking place or broken up in the UK, the subway bombings, the 10 airliners that were supposed to be hijacked and blown up over the Atlantic, these were second and third generation British citizens. They were a part of that culture. But that feeling of alienation and marginality has persisted and perpetuated itself through 2 or 3 generations. Now, I don't see that as a clash of civilizations so much as a clash of identities within a civilization. Let's take the example of Belgium. If you're in Belgium now, the #1 name for a child born in Belgium is Mohammed. It's not surprising. It's the most common given name in the world now. But if you happen to be, let's say, of Flemish ancestry, no doubt you're thinking to yourself, where is this going? What's going to happen to my precious country's history, our language, our place in the world? And if you're Muhammad, you're thinking, these people don't want me. I'll never be one of them. It's not surprising that for that Muhammad, Islam would become more than a religion, it would become an identity. And it's not surprising that he would go to the mosque, where he would find other angry and alienated young men like him, and that the imam would minister to those feelings, and that it would come to be seen as a radical mosque. I just want to divert for a moment to, since I'm talking about Europe, to talk a little bit about how much more blessed we are in America with our own Arab and Muslim communities, who are so much more a part of our society than is the case in Europe. If you wonder what makes you safer in this country, it's not the contact lens solution they take away from you at the airport. It's the fact that the average American Muslim makes a higher wage than the average American, is twice as likely to go to college, is much less likely to go to prison. Compare that to the situation in France, where 7 or 10% of the population is Muslim. 50% of the prisoners are. What a measure of alienation and marginality. Now, displacement certainly doesn't explain everything about why people join Al-Qaeda, as no single factor could. Al-Qaeda is composed of nihilists and idealists, and they each come for different reasons. And I'm going to talk about several other reasons, beginning with economic ones. The Muslim world is a fifth of the world's population, but half of the world's poor. If you think about the Arab world, it reaches from Morocco to the Persian Gulf. It's about the size of the United States. There are 300 million Arabs, about the number there are Americans. Now, if you were to take the oil out of those Arab economies, those 300 million Arabs produce less for export than the 5 million Finns, essentially about what the Nokia telephone company makes, which is the main product of Finland. This is the little Nokia phone that I carried around in Saudi Arabia. As Stefan mentioned, I couldn't get into Saudi Arabia as a reporter. For a year and 4 months, they refused to let me in. So finally, I had to take a job. And expat workers is something that they understand. So I became the mentor to these young reporters in Saudi Arabia, in Jeddah, bin Laden's hometown. And I often reflected on the fact that this one product outweighs the industrial output of the entire Arab world. Now, put oil back into those economies. The 300 million Arabs produce their gross national product is less than half of that of California. Expand the thinking to talk about the Muslim world. There are 1.3 billion Muslims. Most of them, the preponderance, live in the 57 countries that comprise the Organization of the Islamic Conference. Their gross national product is less than that of Germany. So we're starting from the fact that these are barren economies that offer their young people very little future to look forward to. Another factor that's harder to quantify, but I think is very relevant, is the lack of civil society. Now, this varies. I'm not trying to aggregate all Muslim or Arab countries. They're all different in every way. But let me just talk a little bit about the situation in Saudi Arabia. For my young reporters, imagine being a young Saudi yourself. There are no movies, no theaters, no plays, no dating. The internet is monitored and controlled. There are very few parks or museums. There's no political life, no political life. There's no political parties, no unions. That entire space of life that we call civil society simply doesn't exist. There's nothing between the government and the mosque except shopping. Recently, a new IKEA furniture store opened up in Jeddah, and it was such a thrilling event that 15,000 people showed up. 2 were trampled to death. Now, it's not surprising in such circumstances that people are depressed. One of my reporters did a story about a study of depression that was done at King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah. It was bin Laden's alma mater. Of the 2,000 students surveyed, 65% of the boys and 72% of the girls had symptoms of depression. 7% of the girls, Muslim girls, admitted that they had attempted suicide. Now, a further factor that's also difficult to quantify is the separation of the sexes. This meeting, for instance, could never take place in Saudi Arabia or in some other Muslim societies. Women wouldn't be here. This takes a toll on women. I'll tell you the story of one of my reporters, Najla Fathi, who had an interview in Riyadh one morning, and the interview was set too early for her to get there for the first plane from Jeddah to arrive, so she had to fly in the night before. Now, a Saudi woman can't drive. A Saudi woman can't travel without the permission of her male guardian, be it her father, her husband, perhaps her brother, even her son, whichever is the male in charge of her. So she secured the permission to travel. She flew to Riyadh. As a single Saudi woman, she couldn't check into a hotel. So she sat down. The Riyadh airport closes a little after 11, and the guard came through and said, "You can't stay here." And Najla, who is covered up except for this little cat's eye gold-rimmed glasses, I never saw her face in the entire time we worked, but she has plenty of attitude. What are you going to do with me? Well, what could he do with her? He finally let her sleep on the carpet of the mosque in the airport. They turned out the lights, locked the airport, and the next day they opened the airport up. Najla got up and went to her appointment. Now that's the situation for a Saudi woman. But this also takes a toll on men as well. They're deprived of the solace of female companionship. They haven't spent their adolescence molding their behavior around pleasing girls, which is a lot of what civilization really is. It's not so easy to be a terrorist if your girlfriend won't let you, I can tell you. I could go the entire day in Saudi Arabia and not see a woman at all unless I went to the grocery store or the mall. And sometimes you couldn't even tell what direction they were facing. One time I went to the mall with one of my male reporters, and there were 2 Saudi women descending the escalator. They were entirely encased in black. Even their eyes were covered like a bird cage. BMOs, the Saudi guys call them, black moving objects. Without a trace of irony, my reporter turned to me and said, "Check them out." Now, a further and even more difficult to define factor is the element of humiliation. Many of the people who are in radical Islam or Al-Qaeda have been personally humiliated. Certainly the Egyptian core of Al-Qaeda through the prisons of Egypt have been subjected to severe forms of torture and personally humiliated. So humiliation is a real factor. But I was watching a video of Osama bin Laden speaking in the bin Laden family mosque in 1988. He was just back from Afghanistan. and he was talking to other young Saudis, and his theme was humiliation. We are looked upon as sheep, and we are very humiliated, he says. And I thought to myself, why does this rich, young, charismatic man feel humiliated? Neither he nor the other young Saudis in the mosque has ever been beaten or set upon by wild dogs in an Egyptian prison like so many of the Egyptians had been. So why does the concept of humiliation strike such a chord? I think what we're talking about to some extent is a profound sense of cultural humiliation. In some respects, ironically enough, it goes back to September 11th, 1683, which is when the King of Poland arrived to break the Ottoman siege of Vienna, turning back the furthest advance of Muslim armies into Europe. Every Muslim knows there was once one great superpower, and it was Islam. And many Muslims, like bin Laden, feel like it is their turn again. Now, this sense of humiliation is linked to a desire to strike back. Professor Lewis captured this, I think, I remember you're saying or reading once that there was a movement from how did this happen to us to who did this to us. That, I think, is a very sage observation. The link between humiliation and the longing for revenge, I think, is very profound. And this sense of injustice that's been inflicted on the Islamic world has been reinforced by countless images of Muslims under siege in Lebanon, in Iraq, and Palestine. I was in Saudi Arabia during the 2003 war, and I watched the war on Fox and Al Jazeera, two rather similar news organizations. Each was wedded to a particular narrative. On Fox, it was America's liberation of the oppressed Iraqi people. On Al Jazeera, it was the continuing humiliation of the Arabs. There were countless shots of surrendering Iraqi troops with their hands behind their heads, shuffling past the Americans. There was one scene that I first saw on CNN. It was of a pair of U.S. Marines that were knocking on the door of a house that they intended to search. And a retired American general, dressed very much like me in a turtleneck, and he had his sleeves pulled up and a little pointer, was demonstrating to the television audience the proper way in which the soldiers were evacuating the home. Notice their stance, he says, on either side of the door, as the father is made to bring out his wife and children. Notice the placement of their hands on the outside of the trigger guard, ignoring the faces of three little girls whose lips are quivering and whose eyes are so wide with fright it's as if they could explode. Notice the way the soldiers have taken control of the situation, the general said, as the family was made to kneel in front of the Americans. It's one thing to see that on CNN. It's another to see it on Al Jazeera, where that scene was captured and repeated endlessly, obsessively, ritualistically, because it expressed so poignantly the theme of the war from the Arab perspective. Now, this sense of humiliation, I think, is expanded by the fact that if you can imagine living in a culture where nearly everything you touch is made somewhere else, your own culture has contributed so little. Even if you're a terrorist, your weapons are made in China or the U.S. You can't put your hands on anything that your own people have produced. The kinds of measurements that we use for cultural excellence, Nobel Prize winners, Olympic champions, practically absent from the Muslim world at large. Now, bin Laden did have a strategy in his attacks on America. He wanted to get the U.S. to replicate the mistake that the Soviet Union had made in going into Afghanistan. If you recall, 1979, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, spent 10 years there at enormous loss of blood and treasure, withdrew, and what happened? The Soviet Union dissolved. It fell apart. Now, in bin Laden's mind, the same thing could be done to the United States. The United States could become the disunited states. He envisioned Afghanistan as a great bear trap for us. And so he was provoking us in order to get us to attack in Afghanistan. Well, of course, he miscalculated. In just a very short space of time, 6 weeks, American and coalition forces swept aside the Taliban, pummeled al-Qaeda. If you read the accounts of al-Qaeda insiders, they admit that 80% of their membership was captured or killed. Yes, the leaders got away, but they were scattered, they were destitute, they were unable to communicate, and they were repudiated all over the world, even in the Muslim world. The war on terror was essentially dead. It was Iraq that breathed that monster back to life. Iraq looks a lot like what bin Laden had in mind for us in Afghanistan. It offers al-Qaeda a whole new country to train in. Now, it's true that the leaders of al-Qaeda are isolated and to some extent reduced to virtual presences on the internet and smuggled videos. But one of the chilling facts about al-Qaeda is that it had planned for this day. As early as 1998, the strategists and ideologues in al-Qaeda began to envision the day when the leadership would be smashed and that al-Qaeda would have to recreate itself in a new form. The old al-Qaeda was a top-down hierarchical organization. If you had to buy a spare tire, you had to sign a form in triplicate. On the other hand, you had health care. You had a month-long paid vacation. It was a good job for a lot of guys. The leaders of al-Qaeda knew that wouldn't last, and they began to design something that would be more like a network of small groups that would spring up spontaneously, loosely connected through the internet or through training in Afghanistan or Pakistan. Their model was more like street gangs, and you see that at work in Madrid and London. They're flat, horizontal groups by comparison with the old al-Qaeda, tied together by the internet, which offers them a safe place to conspire. And al-Qaeda has made tremendous use of the internet. It's full of documents, of propaganda, of history, of targets, of military manuals. It's a legacy for future jihadis. And yes, the internet is very important. But as important as that is, the training camps were a vital element in the success of al-Qaeda, which is one reason why eliminating the sanctuaries in Afghanistan was so important. Now, however, al-Qaeda has new sanctuaries in Mali, in the western provinces of Iraq, in the tribal areas of Pakistan, probably still in Somalia, very likely once again in Afghanistan. So far from being homeless, al-Qaeda has roots in many different countries now. And I just told you that a few years ago, al-Qaeda was dead, the war on terror was over. How has it been able to reconstitute itself so vigorously? In 1998, Abu Bakr Naji, one of the principal strategists of al-Qaeda, began to publish his masterwork called The Management of Savagery. Now, in there, he proposes a novel and bold plan. Savagery, he points out, offers both danger and opportunity. He recommended that jihadists attack the tourist areas and the oil refineries in Arab and African countries so that the governments would have to retreat to protect their vital installations, leaving the margins unprotected and chaotic and exposed to the deprivations of gangs of Al-Qaeda, very much like what you saw happen in Somalia. The Taliban, of course, provides a model. Now, in that, according to Abu Bakr Naji, in that situation, people will sense the weakness of their government and lose confidence in it. And they will turn to any strong force for safety, even the force that created this chaos in the first place. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who was the late leader of Iraq, brought the management of savagery to a whole new level. He introduced the signature of the postmodern barbarian when he cut off the head of an American contractor and posted the video on the internet, and then began his campaign of bombing Shiite mosques, deliberately attempting to create the civil war that is now destroying our effort to create a unified and democratic Iraq. It's Zarqawi's legacy that we're facing now. In 2005, Fuad Hussein, a Jordanian journalist, produced the most definitive outline of Al-Qaeda's master plan in his biography of Zarqawi. It's chilling to read this work and see how closely events have hewed to Al-Qaeda's forecast. According to Hussein, Al-Qaeda inaugurated a 20-year plan beginning on 9/11, a stage he calls the awakening. Hussein writes that by striking America, the head of the serpent, Al-Qaeda would cause the U.S. to, quote, lose consciousness and act chaotically against those who attacked it. This entitled the party that hit the serpent to lead the Islamic nation. That first stage ended in 2003 when American troops entered Baghdad. Now that U.S. troops were involved in this conflict in the Middle East, the second eye-opening stage began. This is when Iraq would become a recruiting ground for young jihadis. This stage was scheduled to last until 2006. In the third stage, arising and standing up, Al-Qaeda will focus on Syria, Turkey, and at long last, Israel. The fourth stage, which is supposed to last until 2013, will see Al-Qaeda overthrowing Arab governments. Attacks on the petroleum industry will weaken Western economies, and American power will continue to decline in the constantly expanding universe of confrontation. In the fifth stage, the Islamic Caliphate will be declared, and the balance of power will finally tip in the favor of the radical Islamists. Israel will no longer be able to defend itself. The sixth phase, beginning in 2016, will be a period of total confrontation. The Caliphate will form an Islamic army, inaugurating a final apocalyptic battle between the believers and the unbelievers. By 2020, definitive victory will be achieved. Victory, as defined by Al-Qaeda, means falsehood will come to an end. The Islamic State will lead the human race once again to the shore of safety and the oasis of happiness. This is Al-Qaeda's script for the future. The ambition and scope of their dream is breathtaking, and it's given force by the longing of so many young Muslims to reverse the course of history. The failure of the American project in Iraq is bound to embolden Al-Qaeda and radical Islamists everywhere. And it's no wonder that Americans feel so pessimistic in this contest. Whatever we decide to do in Iraq, there are measures we can take to defeat the radical Islamists, especially Al-Qaeda, and I'm going to sketch out a few of these for you. Number one, we have to fix our intelligence, which has done such a terrible job of understanding, much less penetrating and disrupting Al-Qaeda. If you look in my book, one of the heroes of it is Ali Safan, who on 9/11 was one of 8 Arabic-speaking agents in the FBI. No one came closer than Ali Safan to stopping 9/11, and he might have been able to do it had the CIA cooperated with him. There are fewer fluent speakers in the FBI now than there were on 9/11. The FBI says they have 25 Arabic speakers. I've spoken to some of these guys. They went to Middlebury College for 9 weeks, and they can order breakfast, but they cannot interrogate a suspect. It's not a joke when the head of counterterrorism for the FBI testifies under oath that he doesn't know the difference between a Sunni and a Shiite, and that he thinks that's an irrelevant question. If you don't know the first thing about your enemy, you're bound to have a failure of imagination, an inability to connect the dots. If you go up on the 7th floor of FBI headquarters in Washington, an organization that made its reputation fighting against the mafia and to some extent the IRA, who's up there? Irish and Italian guys. It's not surprising they were effective in fighting against those organizations. They came from the same neighborhoods. They spoke the same languages. They understood the community that they were working against. Until you go up there and you find native speakers of Arabic, Pashto, Dari, Urdu, the languages of the communities they're trying to understand, you're always going to have a failure. Now, at great expense since 9/11, we've added a new tier of bureaucracy, the Directorate of Intelligence. We've added a new Department of Homeland Security. Has either of these things made us safer? No. Have they added to the vital store of intelligence? No. What would do that? Skilled people on the ground would do that. And that's where we failed. I've just been picking on the FBI because they're open enough about their records to disclose who works for them. But just to take another, this is true all across the American intelligence community. But just to take a look at our embassy in Baghdad, there are 1,000 people in that embassy. Only 6 of them fluently speak Arabic. How are we going to succeed in this adventure if we don't have people who understand the culture that we're trying to change? After 9/11, many Arab and Muslim Americans came forward and offered their help to the American intelligence. They were spurned. Many of them went into the U.S. Army, which gladly accepted their help. And what did they do? They became interpreters in Iraq, the most dangerous imaginable assignment. After 4 years of serving their country, they can't get a job in American intelligence because they're considered a security risk. Well, there is a security at risk. It's our security. And we have to turn to the people who can help us. I know I'm ranting, but just last year, FBI graduated a new class of 50 new agents. Only one of them speaks a foreign language at all. Now, secondly, we desperately need allies in this effort. We're so alone now. And you all remember what it was like right after 9/11, when the whole world was bending in our direction. The term anti-Americanism seemed to have vanished from the lexicon. We're so radioactive now that every good thing we try to do causes people to draw away. We have to work really hard to enlist allies. And after all, it's in their own interest. Many countries have much more at stake in Iraq, for instance, than we do. Look at Europe. Just take the example of Sweden, where there are 80,000 Iraqi refugees right now and 1,000 coming every month. That's going to have profound effects on that country long after America is no longer in Iraq. Consider the far greater consequence for Iraq's neighbors, who have millions of refugees and are facing the likely consequence of a regional religious war. there are a lot of reasons why people should be helping us in Iraq, and we haven't been able to marshal their help in an effective manner. And the last thing, I may sound Pollyanna in this regard. I don't think anybody would think I'm a Pollyanna at this point, but you might after this. I really do think that we're in a very pregnant moment in the Israeli-Palestinian crisis, and that we have an opportunity to make a difference. We may not be able to make peace. It's difficult to make people make peace. And historically, the governments of Israel and the Palestinian people have never been weaker than they are now. They're crippled. But it's clear that the Arabs are suing for peace. They're facing a far greater danger, and they want peace. We have, I think, a very great opportunity to restore our reputation as an honest broker. And I would focus on the settlements. I say that because of Israel's interest in the future. If we want Israel to survive, we have to create a prosperous, unified, successful Palestine. If you create a failed state on Israel's border, what have you done? So we need to do everything possible, and one of the possible things we can do is declare out front that we don't support those settlements. They're illegal and they are not in the interest of peace. Those people can go back to Israel or they can become Palestinian citizens. But we need to succeed in Israel and Palestine right now. It's not going to change Al-Qaeda, but it will reduce the pool of recruits, and it will certainly reduce the inflammation that is so much at the cause of Muslim anger in the world. Now, people tend to be depressed when I talk. So I'm going to leave you with 3 reasons why Al-Qaeda won't win. One is, everyone is its enemy. After U.S. and coalition forces went into Afghanistan in 2001, they found in one of the camps a list of enemies. And the list is, number 1, heretics, the Mubaraks of the world, it said. Number 2, Shiites. Number 3, Israel. Number 4, America. That's a lot of enemies for a little organization like Al-Qaeda. Now, but the list keeps expanding. One of Al-Qaeda's ideologues, Abu Musab al-Suri, says the list of enemies is now Jews, Westerners in general, members of NATO alliance, Russia, China, atheists, pagans, and hypocrites. I'm sure I touched some of you out there. The second reason is that most of the victims of Al-Qaeda are Muslims. Many times more Muslims have died at the hands of Al-Qaeda in Iraq alone than died on 9/11. Look at the attacks that took place subsequent to 9/11 in Casablanca, in Istanbul, in Bali, in Jakarta, in Riyadh, and just last week in Algiers. These are Arab Muslim countries. Muslims know that Al-Qaeda is their enemy too, and that they will be the first to suffer under Al-Qaeda rule. Now, the final reason Al-Qaeda won't win is that Al-Qaeda offers nothing to the people that follow it. If you had Osama bin Laden standing here rather than Lawrence Wright, and you were able to ask him, Mr. bin Laden, by the way, how are you going to address the real problems of the Muslim world? Joblessness, illiteracy, gender apartheid. By the way, what kind of economic model do you follow? Are you a Marxist, a Keynesian, a free marketeer? He's never thought of any of those things. Al-Qaeda doesn't believe in politics because it doesn't believe in the future. It's not really a political movement. It's more like a reaction, like a snake bite. It does offer one thing to the people who follow it, and that is death. When I was in Pakistan, I had the opportunity to talk to a distinguished Pakistani journalist, Rahimullah Yousafzai, who covered the jihad against the Soviets in Afghanistan in the 80s. And he recalled coming upon an encampment of Arab fighters in white tents on an open field. And he said to them, "What are you thinking? You can easily be seen from the air. The Soviet Air Force will wipe you out." And one of the Arabs responded by saying, "But we came to die." Death, not victory, over the Soviets was the call that summoned the Arabs to Afghanistan. If you talk to the jihadis, very few of them thought they had any chance of victory. They were seeking martyrdom. That's the soil in which Al-Qaeda was planted. If you think of Al-Qaeda, I'm sure we all think of it as a terror organization. But from the point of view of the young men who join it, it's really a suicide machine. We love death, the call that summoned the Arabs to Afghanistan in the first place. Al-Qaeda gives them a chance to make history. All they have to do is die. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks so very much. And now we have actually time for questions and comments. And I'd like to ask the first question, if I may. I'd really like to ask a question about this humiliation issue. And as you said, the Ottoman army that besieged Vienna and finally defeated in 1683 was mainly composed of Turks, Albanians, and Bosnians. And why do you think that Bosnians, Turks, and if you ask a Turk, what happened on September 11th, 1683, if he is not or she is not a historian, that person would say, "I have no idea." Yeah. Why do you think that Bosnians, Albanians, and Turks feel less humiliated about this defeat than people in Najd and Asir, actually, who did not really send troops and defeated? And during those days, those people were not even recognizing Ottomans as true representatives of Islam. And again, a kind of connected question: why do you think that Al-Qaeda ideology finds more fertile ground in regions such as Najd, Asir, which were never dominated by the foreigners, than areas colonized and have dominated by the Western powers for many, many years?
Okay. Thank you for that. I think that it's an interesting phenomenon that there are no Turks that I know of in Al-Qaeda. And why would that be? There are very few Bosnians. I think that, especially given the example of Turkey, a young, to use a phrase, Turk, has the opportunity to affect his society, has the opportunity to prosper, has the opportunity to marry and date. So there's no reason to look to history for examples of former greatness, because as I described, I think, in Saudi Arabia, life is so circumscribed that that one starts casting around, looking for examples of former greatness. I've always been struck by the irony, the bitter irony, the reference you sometimes see in the speeches of bin Laden and Zawahiri to Andalusia. And the caliphate that was in Spain. Any of you who have ever been to Granada or any of the great cities of that ancient empire, you're brought to your knees by the beauty of it, by the example of tolerance, by its exaltation of poetry and literature and learning. If Al-Qaeda stood for those things, who would stand against it? They only use this. They use history selectively to inflame their followers. And it's just an example of the perversion of scholarship and learning that they can cite such things to bring young Muslims into their fold.
Excellent speech, thank you. In your judgment, as we sit here today, what is the best way to extricate ourselves or to solve the problem in Iraq?
I was opposed to going in, and now I find myself in the awful spot of being opposed to getting out. I think we have a moral burden to do as well as we can by the Iraqi people. We may not be able to do anything. It may be that we'll fail in any regard, but I think we have an obligation to try to create a space of calm so that the Iraqi people might be able to organize themselves. As I say, I'm no expert on Iraq, and I have no prognostications. I can't offer you any solutions, and nor can anyone, it seems. I think I've been looking through the world through Al-Qaeda's lenses for a long time now, and if I'm Al-Qaeda, I'm happy either way. I'm happy if America stays because I have it's a recruiting ground. The regional civil war, religious war that Zarqawi had tried to create is prospering like crazy. So that's not such a bad outcome. On the other hand, if America withdraws and leaves in its wake a ruined state, full of chaos, perhaps a likely genocide, and then the prospect of regional religious war spreading and engulfing those other countries. I'm not trying to be an alarmist. I'm just saying that those things are likely, and anybody that's acquainted with the Middle East knows that things can get out of hand in a very dangerous way. I hope those things don't happen, but they might happen if we withdraw, and we have to keep that very grave thing in our minds and not fool ourselves to think that there are easy paths out.
You said that Al-Qaeda gives people debt, and that's why they are attracted to Al-Qaeda. But I want to suggest that Al-Qaeda also offers people something to do, people who don't have much to do in their societies. And so having said that, I wanted to suggest that I thought it was interesting that your third point in what we can do to defeat radical jihadists is to address the Israeli-Palestinian situation. But I think that we have to even go further and address other sources of humiliation in that part of the world, so that we can encourage others not to join the radical jihadis. And I think only by addressing some of the conditions, the absence of social justice, the absence of things to the economic marginalization, the enemy in that part of the world, that's the way I think that may be the way to defeat radical jihadis, by preventing their recruitment to continue. And I wondered if you had anything.
I think of Al-Qaeda being like an engine that runs on the despair of the Muslim world. There's a river of despair that you can't ignore. And so in the large sense, how do you fight despair? With hope. And many different ways. Jobs is one, more open societies is another, greater sense of justice, but there's a limit to what we can do, and this is a real quandary. Let's take the example of Egypt. I can't think of another country that would be better prepared for democracy than Egypt. It has, democratic roots during the monarchy. it has a sense of itself as a nation. It's almost eternal, not like Iraq. It's a very political place, and yet, what is the future for Egypt in a real sense? Well, there are two that I see. One is that the Mubarak regime perpetuates itself in the sun, and that seems very likely. Or that the Muslim Brotherhood comes to power through some access of democratic means. Well, I prefer the second in some respects, because I think that democracy is inherently moderating influence. But I don't think it's going to be pretty. I think the Muslim Brotherhood is a shallow political organization that until recently, if you opened up the box of ideas in the Muslim Brotherhood, the only thing in there was a hijab. Now people are demanding more answers of the Brotherhood because they're beginning to look at democracy in a new way. And they may be, many people feel that, they may be a partner for us, but we can't fool ourselves into thinking that our goals are the same. But at least if they come to power through democracy rather than through a bloody revolution, then I think we have a better chance of having it evolve over a long time into something that helps their people more than the governments you see there now.
You said earlier that you would characterize the conflict between the West and the Arab world and the cultural world. Yet later on, you said that the one thing that keeps them going is looking forward to death. And I would say that that's a pretty naked distinction between the ideas and philosophy of the West and most people in the West are not brought up to look forward to death. And secondly, the looking forward to death obviously comes from religious teachings, whether or not one thinks they seriously believe in the 70 virgins that they'll meet up there, or what it is. You said also that when they joined Al-Qaeda, a lot of them weren't particularly religious. So why do you still say that it's not a cultural, religious war?
Well, just to talk a moment about the attractions of death. I've written a lot about religious groups, mainly American movements. And for instance, one of the ones that I wrote about was Jim Jones, a Christian organization. People were drawn to it knowing that it celebrated death, and 900 people committed suicide. So it's not an exclusively Muslim prerogative. And there are suicide gangs and organizations in Japan. You see, across cultures, you see that death has an attraction that is, not exclusive to Al-Qaeda. If you look at someplace like Dubai or Qatar, is a Wahhabi society like Saudi Arabia, but it's much more open and tolerant. Has exactly the same religion. But it's different, profoundly different in its society than Saudi Arabia. So, in my opinion, it's not the religion per se. I think it's the system. It's a combination of many factors, but these rotten political systems that so many Arabs live under is stifling and humiliating, to use that term again, to the ambitions of so many young people.
Bring it back to American foreign policy or American attitude. The concern that I have is that when you look at the current administration in terms of foreign policy, you certainly see what appears to be an active attempt to humiliate those that Americans or their allies see as enemies. We can see it in Lebanon. We could see how the American government deliberately stood back and allowed the Israeli-Lebanon war to continue 3 or 4 extra weeks. We obviously saw it at Abu Ghraib. We see it in situations where the president's attitude about bring them on seems to be one that its intention is to humiliate the other side. And so I guess the question I have, or the comment I have, is that it would appear that American policy is one that has humiliation at its core in terms of what it sees as its enemy, and the visualization of that as a result of CNN or Fox or the photographs that came out of Abu Ghraib. And then the equivalent of that is how our unwavering support of the Israelis, particularly the settlements, and our refusal to recognize the Palestinian elections as being, we recognize them as being democratic, but not to our liking, seems to be just one of constant humiliation of those who are Arabs or Muslims. And I don't see how we can get beyond that in terms of some of the other aspects that were brought up in talking about things that can be done. If every time you turn around, the president or the Secretary of State or the military is acting in a way that, when shown on internet or in the Arab press or even in CNN, is to humiliate the people that we're trying to, quote, help.
Well, I wish that candidate Bush, who wanted to have a humble foreign policy, had actually been the man that took office. I think that, we could take a far, and I suspect that in the future we'll have to take a far more modest role in our foreign relations. Yeah.
I keep hearing, this is the second time this week, about this culture of death. Not just you, but Jim Woolsey said it earlier this week. It comes from a very different perspective. But it's really not a culture of death. It's a culture of an alternative or subsequent life. And I think it's important, don't you, that we stop thinking of dealing with a culture of death, but rather the concept of what comes afterwards. When Allah knows, for example, in this one particular society, who are his true believers, and they get rewarded. And it's not just Islam that has a concept like this, but in many of the other areas, this is the case, of many of the other groups.
I think that we could definitely discuss and attack the ideas of Al-Qaeda having to do with death and suicide in particular. I mean, it's remarkable, really, really remarkable that you see Muslims committing suicide. First of all, what does the Quran say about suicide? It says, do not kill yourselves. It couldn't be clearer. The Prophet Muhammad said that the specific punishment for a suicide would be to spend all of eternity in the act of killing himself with the same instrument he used to die. So how does Al-Qaeda get around this? The genius in this is Ayman al-Zawahiri, the number 2 guy in Al-Qaeda, who bombed the Egyptian embassy in Islamabad, Pakistan in 1995 using suicide bombers. And even members of his own group were upset with him because of the death of innocent Muslims and the intentional suicide of the bombers. So his response to them forms the intellectual justification for Al-Qaeda's future actions on this. First of all, he said, there were no innocents working in the embassy. Everyone from the security guard to the diplomats supported the Egyptian regime, which was blocking the rule of Islam. Yes, there were children and true believers among the victims, but Muslims are so weak and their enemies so strong. In such an emergency, the rules against the slaughter of innocents must be relaxed. The question of suicide was a lot more problematic, as you can imagine. Zawahiri turned to the early martyrs of Christianity as an example. The only example he could cite in Islamic history was that of a group of believers who, early in the history of Islam, who had been captured by idolaters and forced to renounce their religion or die. Zawahiri says it was a suicidal choice. They chose to become martyrs to their belief, and because they were acting for the greater glory of God, they should not be, nor should the bombers of Islamabad, considered to be suicides that will suffer the punishment of hell. They should be considered martyrs who will enjoy the fruits of paradise. Now, can't we all see what sophistry this is? Who cannot see through this? I think there's a willfulness of people who want to believe in this philosophy. And think of, if you are a devout Muslim, what's at risk? Your eternal soul in constant state of being exploded into an airplane or blowing up with a suicide. Can you imagine? I've been struck, I don't know if the others have noticed this or been written about, by how many suicide bombers kill only themselves. You read about these incidents in West Bank, in Israel, and sort of thing, in Morocco recently. How hard would it be to walk into this room and blow yourself up in the middle of it? Why is it that an appreciable number of suicide bombers only kill themselves and maybe wound someone in the distance? It seems very telling to me that the object of that suicide bomber is not to kill but to die.
Yes.
Getting back to this business of staying in Iraq or leaving and when to do the most good and how you do it, I wondered if you'd comment on the fact that General Petraeus has said quite clearly a number of times that there is no military solution. The solution must be diplomatic. And yet the government seems to be totally inept in that area and is focusing on the military.
Well, I agree that there's not going to be a military solution to Iraq, but only the military can provide some kind of protection to the Iraqi people. Diplomats aren't going to do that. If you're faced with death squads, diplomats aren't going to stand in there and protect you. You need armed men to listen. I don't mean to represent myself as an expert on this subject at all. I'm not going to tell you that I think that the best course of action is this, to stay in and that at the end of the day there's going to be peace and unity in Iraq. I don't know that. I worry about both things. I worry about staying in and I worry about pulling out. And I think that, we'd be crazy not to consider the consequences of both of those actions. And anyone who advocates one or the other has to acknowledge the dangers that are implicit in their course of action.
Between 1948 and 1967, the West Bank was in the hands of Jordan, the Gaza Strip was in the hands of Egypt, there were no walls, there was no whatever. Certainly a Palestinian state could have been established then. What was the reaction of Jordan? They annexed the West Bank. The Egyptians did absolutely nothing. I think the sense of the humiliation that you talked about, and you so stressed as so important, is misplaced because a state could have been created by the Arab world, and it wasn't.
Well, I think that no one who cares for Arabs, and I do, can help but feel angry by the self-defeating politics that characterize that part of the world. And it is very frustrating to see how many times they've missed opportunities to make peace. So I'm not apologizing for that, but I do think I still think very strongly that there's an opportunity for us to help them make peace, and we have to seize it.
What you said about the type of person that was a radical Muslim, I did a study of the young Palestinian suicide bombers, and they were all the honor students, the mother's best boys, and so forth as well. Of course, that whole society is disaffected. And in this country too, we had the hippies, the 60s, the 70s, we had motorcycle gangs, the 90s, we've had street gangs. They're all people that are, and we had the Columbine guys who were white Americans, who are all disaffected by the society closest to them. So I think it's always there. But I do see that Islam, even non-Al-Qaeda Muslims, have one favorite topic called the inevitable, meaning death. In America, we talk about death and taxes. But in Islam, and you can't evade taxes, some people get away with that, but nobody evades death. And they really focus on that. And I think that's at the root of a lot of these issues.
Yeah, I agree.
What is the Islamic world doing, the Islamic intellectual religion doing, if anything, to counter this idea, this jihadist ideology, to counter this lack of civil society, to try to promote this modernization and hope?
Well, I have to disaggregate, the Arab world, and put it down into, there are different things going on in different places. But bear in mind, these entrenched autocrats that rule most of the Arab world have an investment in staying in power. And they're not going to easily let us go in and democratize their country and push them aside. If we face a choice, they will help us on terrorism, or they will or we will fight them on the question of democracy. Egypt is a great example. We've retreated entirely from our efforts to democratize in Egypt. There are places that are making some progress. Yemen, little odd places. That Yemen is having, and our country has helped in some regards, training people for democracy in Yemen. It's not making great strides, but you shouldn't have such ambitions that we can make enormous, rapid changes in the Middle East. You can make changes, but there's a certain amount of social change that people can take. And I'm just talking about not even the governments right now, but if you take the example of Saudi Arabia, people talk about how conservative it is and how slow it is to change. The editor of the paper where I worked in Jeddah was my age, and he had been a young shepherd in Asir in the south. He didn't see an automobile until he was 9 years old. He wore a garland of flowers in his hair like the little Assyri boys with curls and stuff like that. And he eventually went to Jeddah, and then he got a degree at the University of Texas in comparative literature. But the entire industrial revolution in the technological world he lived out in his lifetime. And that was characteristic of a lot of Saudis. They grew up in mud huts. The whole flood of change has been so head-stamping that when you start talking about change, there's a kind of reluctance. Moreover, if you look at Saudi Arabia, which is a fascinating country and so stuck, and you think, well, you look at the frustration, the hopelessness, the anger, the despair that's so characteristic of that country. And you think, well, what force is greater that would keep them everywhere else in the country? When you have those factors, you have revolutions, coups, and civil wars. What's going on in Saudi Arabia? What force is greater? Fear is that force. And I'm not speaking of fear of the government. The Saudis don't fear their government. It's not nearly as cruel to its citizens or subjects, to use the correct word, as the Egyptians are. What they fear is the alternative. If you look at the neighborhood the Saudis live in, the revolution in Egypt brought on an enduring autocracy far less liberal than the monarchy it replaced. Same thing in Syria. In Iran, the revolution brought the mullahs. In Somalia, tribal chaos. And then, of course, Iraq, which embodies all the fears the Saudis harbor about themselves. So change does not equal progress in the Middle East.
We can take one last question. Yes.
What do you think of the speech last night in Great Britain about an imminent attack coming there?
I think that Europe is very exposed, and I don't know if there's going to be an imminent attack. I don't have any inside knowledge about it, but I do think that there are many radical Muslims operating in the UK, and it's qualitatively different from the situation that we face here. I remember when I had iftar a few years ago, the meal you take to break the fast at the end of the day in the month of Ramadan, in Birmingham, England, with a group of radical Islamists. And one of my dinner companions said that he supported the kidnapping and beheading of aid workers in Iraq. And it was just when Margaret Hassan, who was the director of Iraqi Care International, had been captured, and she wasn't dead yet, but and I thought, he's dangerous. But I looked around the room and I saw all these nodding heads. And I thought, that's what's really dangerous, are those nodding heads, because they surround him with a community of approval that allows him to express those ideas and maybe develop them, to recruit people. This is a real problem in England right now. And I think all over Europe, there's going to be, in France and Spain and Germany in particular, in the aftermath of the Iraqi war, you'll see jihadi veterans returning to that area and joining up with pre-existing or new cells with enormous training, with a network that they've now created in Iraq, with resources. I don't think that the future in Europe looks very attractive.
Well, on that note,
I told you.